Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Bruchhaus, and welcome back to the Class Play Podcast. As we did the last couple weeks, we covered the top 4 quarterbacks on the Class Play, and we're adding one more right before the draft, courtesy of our guest here today, Asa Arnold. We're covering quarterback 5, Michael Penix Jr. This podcast will be a companion piece to the appendix of the tour of the top 4 written piece on Sumer Sports, which will be coming out tomorrow. Asa, welcome. Tell us a little bit about your podcast. Tell us a little bit about the piece you just wrote. Excited to have you on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It was really fun writing this piece. Michael Penix is one of the most confusing but cool guys to study of all the quarterbacks. And then in regards to my podcast, it's about equally as nerdy as anything on Sumer Sports, but probably not quite as professional. So if you're into that sort of thing, I think you should check it out. It's titled Analytics with Asa.
Awesome. Thanks, Asa. You did a lot of hard work on this piece, and I'm excited for the people to get to read it tomorrow. Joining us as always, Tej. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm really excited that Ace is here to talk about Michael Penix today. You know, I've been lucky to be able to go on his podcast a couple of times, so I'm glad we're doing like a home and home where he can come on our show today and talk about Michael Penix.
Yeah, Tej and I have been on Asa's podcast, Analytics with Asa, as he mentioned. Focusing on Sumer Sports before we start, a lot of cool stuff coming out in draft period. We'll be having the draft show on Thursday. We've obviously published articles, the rookie guide that can get you ready for the big day. We'll be following up with live streams. Thomas Dimitrov and Eric Eager will be live with me, Tej, Sean Syed, Ben Brown reporting from Detroit. Keep an eye out on @SumerSports on Twitter or the Sumer Sports YouTube page for more information. And guys, let's get into Michael Penix. As we do, Asa, give us one word, given all your research on Michael Penix.
So there are a few words that I could have possibly used, but the first one that really came to mind for me was crystallized. And the reason I say that is because Penix is not only older in age compared to most of the other prospects in this draft, but he also has extensive collegiate experience. I also think there's a lot of skills that he displays that are translatable to the NFL. So that includes like sack avoidance, accuracy, things that NFL coaches like to see.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, man. I mean, you look at that long career that he's had, and a lot of things have happened. You get a lot of information. Tej and I and Ben on previous podcasts have talked about how this is kind of the first year where COVID, the transfer portal, NIL have played a factor. Tej, what's a word that you'd use to describe Michael Penix?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Sam. And the word that I have for him is resilient. I mean, you look at his injury history, 2018 ACL tear, 2019 fractured shoulder, 2020 another ACL tear on the same right ACL, and then 2021 he had shoulder separation with his joint. So he really had to overcome a lot. He bounced back, played pretty well in 2022, played really well last season, and he headed into the Pac-12 championship where they had played 3 straight one-score games. They had won all of them. They were all very exciting games to watch, but he was able to overcome a lot in that game. They had some injuries at receiver, and I remember listening to the Cover 3 podcast a couple times during the season. They had mentioned that there was the flu even going around Washington's locker room, supposedly. So, like, you go into that game against Oregon as 9.5-point underdogs, and you come out and really blow the doors off of them. Like, I think he was just so resilient. He showed a lot of grit throughout his entire college career and really capped it off with the national championship run last year.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think you take the crystallized word that Asa used, and you take that resiliency that he's shown over his career, and that kind of builds into what my word was for him, and that's high floor. I think he's a high floor player, and generally we'll see those players who kind of avoid sacks, are pretty accurate at the college level, or do have a high floor. I think, you think about Gardner Minshew and the things he's kind of been able to do on multiple teams. I think Gardner Minshew was a little bit more of a long shot, but you look at Michael Penix, and I think the reason why people are considering him as a first-round quarterback is because he has that high floor. And obviously going into that high floor are the pros and cons of his game. Tej, what are some of the pros and cons of his game?
Yeah, so the main one that I like to look at is he can handle a lot of volume. We talked about on the JJ McCarthy show that we did, like, we don't really know what he's going to look like when he has to drop back 45 times in the game. Michael Penix Jr. did a lot of that at Washington. It was a very pass-centric offense that was centered around him and the NFL-style receivers he had. So his 63.2% usage rate from StatsBomb was the highest in this class. I think he's also someone who is able to keep a pretty healthy time to throw that doesn't lead to many negative plays. I think that there's been a lot of good research done on what happens when you have a high time to throw, when pressured versus not pressured. I think he does a pretty good job of balancing that out and getting rid of the ball when pressured, but also being able to hold on to the ball and let his receivers win their routes before throwing to them when not pressured. And just the velocity on his passes. I mean, you think about some of the games he had during the season that we're going to talk about later, where you can really see the zip on the ball with him fitting into tight windows. So I liked all of that from him. I think that's, Sam, you mentioned the high floor. Like, I think hopefully all of those things combined, like, give him a little bit of a higher floor than some other prospects in this class. But there are some cons. His ability, or his lack of not scrambling, I think is something that might hurt him at the next level. He is pretty athletic. Like, he ran a fast 40 at his pro day, played baseball and ran track in high school, but he doesn't seem to scramble that much. He had the lowest scramble rate of the top 8 quarterbacks. His age is obviously something that we have to mention. It is interesting to see his progression from playing at Indiana to playing at Washington, but he has been in college so long. So you wonder how much more development there is for him compared to someone like Drake May or JJ McCarthy. And, Ben Solak did a lot of good quarterback charting that was published last week, and his accuracy doesn't look super favorable on him. He struggled with accuracy in the intermediate areas of the field, but we'll see how he maybe can improve on that at the next level.
Yeah, I mirror many of the same things that you said. That pressure to sack ratio, I think, is going to be key for his pro prospects. And obviously, he was very aggressive in those years at Washington going downfield. Now, does that mean that he had great wide receivers? Yes, it means that he was pushing the ball down the field to Jalen Polk and to Rome Odunze. But it also means he's willing to do it, and you just have to be willing to do it at the professional level. You look at the cons. You mentioned the athleticism, but the lack of desire to run. Asa, I think you'll have more information on that. It's very strange. And then, as you said, Tej, like, you look at the raw numbers, and I think this is kind of the MO across the board for Penix. You look at some of the raw numbers, and they're great, but you dig into the charting stats, the zones of the field, the precise passes, the route tree, and just for whatever reason, it doesn't really add up. And that's across, Ben Solak's charting. That's with reception perception. And it's really interesting. So, Asa, you took this deep dive look at Michael Penix. What are some of the pros and cons you saw? And what's kind of taking the cover off the book there? What have you seen in the media? What have you seen from coaches? What have you seen in his medicals, in your research, that may give us a better view of how this player will translate to the NFL?
Yeah, I love the points that have been mentioned so far, especially with the word that you used to describe Penix, which is the high floor. And I think that's one of the biggest pros of his game. So one of them is obviously the ability to avoid bad outcomes. He only had 12 turnover-worthy plays in the season, which is lower than projected first overall pick Caleb Williams. He's obviously trusted by coaches. As Tej mentioned, he had the highest usage rate in the entire draft class. And then, as you mentioned before, he obviously trusts his receivers. So it clearly helps that you have like 3 NFL caliber receivers to throw to, but constantly hitting them in stride, trusting them to make a play is a skill that many rookies struggle with. So I think the ability to avoid the bad outcomes is one of the biggest parts of his game. A little bit more in the cons. Obviously, health is the biggest reason why he's questionable to even go in the first round. Dr. Jessica Flynn kind of does this study on him where she looks at shoulder injuries, and she kind of describes those as being potentially fine, but the knee injuries seem to be a little bit more concerning. Having one ACL tear is not the worst thing in the world, but having multiple on the same knee is really not a great look. And that could potentially explain his hesitation in scrambling, where he has this great projectable metric of a 40 yard dash being 4.5, but only scrambling at the 8th lowest out of all the quarterbacks. But his inability to improvise is also one of the big reasons why he might not go as high as these other guys. So he's obviously great at avoiding sacks. That pressure to sack ratio is really, really good. But that is largely due to the fact that he throws it away at a 50% rate when pressured, which is higher than anyone else in the class. And I think that throwing away when pressured is preferable to a sack. There's been some great studies on this, and Tej has provided some really helpful data in that regard. But it's also worth mentioning, are you able to turn a bad play in a good play? I think what Penix is great at doing is turning a bad play into a not terrible play, but being able to demonstrate that ability is something that guys like Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams have demonstrated that Michael Penix has not. So I think that's part of the reason why he hasn't gone as high projection-wise as these other guys.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned that. Based on that projection, we've seen him play a lot of games, and the book is kind of out on him at this point. So, Asa, I'm interested to see, like, a lot of times you can kind of summarize these players' games with a single performance that they had against an opponent. In your analysis, what was the game that kind of showed who Michael Penix is as a player?
So I kind of cheated a bit here, but I think the perfect demonstration of the good of Penix and the bad of Penix are the two college playoff games that he played this season. So obviously Texas showed off the good. He had a willingness to throw. He hit Rome Odunze on several targets that game, and it really demonstrates the potential that he has when paired with receiving talent. Had 430 yards, 97.7 QBR, which was very, very high. But on to the bad. I think Michigan really showed the bad, that whenever he's forced to throw purely underneath, he really struggled. So he's great at hitting those home runs, but the singles, the doubles, he really hasn't demonstrated comfort in being able to do that. His average depth of target fell from 10.7 on the season to just 8 that night, and the results were really poor. He mustered 13 points in the night, 63 QBR, which really isn't that great. So kind of wrapping all that together, I think those two games are the perfect encapsulation of the great of Penix, but also the things to worry about for the team that drafts him.
Yeah, and I think those are two great examples because that's when the national eye was on him. That's when it mattered. And we kind of saw both sides of the coin there. So, Tej, I'm interested in your thoughts on maybe some games that may show us something, maybe not quite on that scale, but will show us who Penix is as a player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like those games that Asa mentioned. So kind of going into the main one that popped to my mind was the first Oregon game from this past year, where you look at Penix, like this is a very hyped up game. Oregon's a super talented team, and they're coming into Washington to play. And I think he came out and very early, like, touchdown pass to Giles Jackson across the middle of the field was one of those high velocity throws that we really liked. He had the touchdown pass to the right corner of the end zone to Jalen Polk. That was another very impressive touchdown pass. Ended up having a pretty impressive day overall, 22 for 37, 302 yards and 4 touchdowns with a 92.4 QBR as Washington won that game 36-30. And then most importantly, he only took 1 sack for a loss of 5 yards the entire game. So you really liked what you saw from him in that game. And I think a lot of it also shows like the scheme was pretty good in that game. And then the receivers stepped up in a big way. Like without McMillan, Giles Jackson, who transferred to Washington, was someone who played a big role in that game. And I think like that's like something that Penix might need at the next level is some support like that, like an Odunze, a Polk, like a really good run game from Dylan Johnson. Like I think all of those things will definitely help him. And then I just wanted to briefly mention the Penn State game from 2020. One of the first Big Ten games after COVID happened. So they're starting in the middle of the season. Like this was, I think, really the play that put him on the map, was going to overtime against a number 8 ranked Penn State team and ending up converting that 2-point conversion, where you can debate whether or not he actually got it, but like just showing that ability that he does pretty rarely, but like was able to do in the moment, where he was able to scramble. Like I think that was a time where you realize the moment is rarely too big for him as a quarterback, and he should be calm, cool, and collected in a lot of those big moments. And I thought that he showed that there against Penn State.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like how you brought up his leaning on his wide receivers. And I think that one of the scouting notes that you see a lot of times is that this guy will always give his wide receivers a chance to win, which in the NFL, when you have top flight wide receivers, specifically on some of these teams that are picking in the range in which we expect him to be picked, that you got to be able to do that. And he obviously has shown over and over that he can. The game that I selected was, I viewed as kind of a precursor to what ended up happening in the Michigan game. And that was the Arizona State game. One of my favorite things to do when breaking down these quarterbacks or breaking down teams or breaking down context is to go to Game on Paper, put on by our friends, gameonpaper.com, put on by our friends at the Sports Dataverse, and just go week by week and see how things changed, how rankings changed, how the matchups were. And then obviously you deep dive into those advanced analytics in the game. And this Arizona State versus Washington game sticks out kind of like a sore thumb for Penix. That ASU team was not very good. It was very weird. It was raining. I will give him the benefit of the doubt on that. It was kind of that Pacific Northwest rain where, you know, he's having to play in a moist environment while expected to throw the ball 35, 40 times. But it seemed like pressure bothered him early. And to Asa's earlier point about how he tends to throw it away, that was kind of the rhythm that the game went into. And you see this high-scoring Washington team only put up 15 points against a team that really wasn't all that good in Arizona State. He has 2 weird interceptions. He has struggles with accuracy all game. And when it really boiled down to it, kind of a better portion, I'd say, of what he did, he still stuck in there and kept standing and kept delivering the ball, even though he was having accuracy problems. But he basically identified 2 things. Number one, Rome Odunze is better than everybody else. So I'm going to just try to push the ball down the field to him all game as we're going down the stretch. And number 2, he kind of was picking on one of their cornerbacks, number 10, Woods. And basically it got to the point where if the ball wasn't going to Odunze, it was going to where number 10 was. And I think that's something that you kind of see quarterbacks pick up also in tough weather games in the pros. And so while it shows kind of the accuracy problems that we've talked about in kind of the meta, even though he ended up, I think, going 27 for 42 or something like that, it also shows that he kind of does have that moxie, that ID method where he just has to figures out something that works and kind of follows it to a win. So mentioning how that kind of translates to the pros, Tej, I'm interested in what a player comparable is from your view.
Yeah, so the player comp that both the Sumer Sports Draft Guide had and one that I actually like a lot is Mac Jones, because I think when you look at both these guys, like you immediately go to the pressure to sack rate that we've been talking about. Michael Penix does have the best pressure to sack rate of any quarterback coming out since 2014, as this table that Football Insights at FB_Insights is putting together on Twitter. And Anthony Richardson second, but Mac Jones is third. So they were both very similar in college with respect to not taking sacks. I also think that they were both quarterbacks who, again, relied a lot on their NFL caliber receivers. And I think they did that to a lot of success in college. And then the last thing is like the ability of not scrambling and kind of like what that means for them as like more of a higher floor, maybe lower ceiling prospect. I hope that, you know, Michael Penix doesn't really have the career progression of Mac Jones where it ends up getting worse for him over time. But I think that they could be very similar coming into the league, where from day one, they could give you starting level caliber play, but maybe we'll see what exactly that high level play could lead to.
Mac Jones projects to be probably one of the better backups too. And I think that's an interesting projection that you make there, because he probably is not necessarily, if not the most pro ready, someone who can contribute day one going into a camp. And I think that's why his projection kind of leads to him to that kind of 12 range, 11 range, where some of the kind of more prepared to win teams are. But it also could lend itself to, you know, just being a long-term backup. So Asa, what are some of the people who you looked at and saw some similarities with?
So this is definitely on the higher end of Michael Penix's range of outcomes, but a player that he really reminded me of when observing was Jared Goff, where he's accurate. He's great at utilizing receiver talent. Obviously with Goff, he had Amon-Ra St. Brown last season. And then when he was with the Rams, he obviously had Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods. And I think if Penix is given the right opportunity where he has that receiving talent, I think he could approach that level of quarterback that Goff has. And then one of the guys that I thought was really interesting that doesn't necessarily translate skill-wise, but just translates with his story is Taysom Hill. It's a guy who had 4 career season-ending injuries, and Michael Penix did as well. And then they both kind of had to adapt their style of play in order to progress further in the league. So with Taysom Hill, he started out as like a pretty traditional, relatively mobile quarterback. And then whenever the Saints got him, he almost turned into like a tight end receiver, running back hybrid. And what I found interesting is that with Penix, these injuries led to him choosing to run less. Whereas with Taysom Hill, it made him choose to run more. And then I think the last point, kind of comparing both Goff and Taysom Hill, is that both Michael Penix and these players are really good in macro level pressure. They're great whenever the situation is high, playoff games. They're great whenever they need a game-winning drive. But as you guys have mentioned, the micro level pressure, whenever he is, close to getting sacked, or if he's hurt as a quarterback, he tends to kind of take the safer route, which isn't a bad thing, but it's not necessarily what you would want from like a franchise-saving quarterback.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And coming off the Taysom Hill, I'm sticking with the Saints quarterback right now with my comp. I look at someone like Derek Carr, and both from the prospect perspective, where he was projected to kind of be in that same range that Penix is, that early second round, maybe he goes higher. Carr ended up going in the early second round, and I think perhaps that's probably where we'll see Penix go on Friday. But you have a player where there's some weird questions that you've kind of outlined, Asa and Tej, of everything that a good quarterback has, Derek Carr has. But there's weird inaccuracies. You watch game after game, and you don't understand why he's not hitting these excellent receivers, especially that he's had with the Saints, with Olave and some of the other talents they've had. You don't understand why it's not clicking at that NFL level, even though he's a pretty much of a prototype player. And then the reason why I really like this comp is because Carr, especially this year, was pretty good at not getting sacked. He's had struggles throughout his career, but his best years, he's always been pretty good at not getting sacked. But he doesn't run a lot, and he really doesn't scramble a lot. And there's a lot of throwaways. And I think that, at the 75th percentile of whatever Michael Penix's distribution ends up being, we can expect him to be kind of in that Derek Carr mold where he is a starting quarterback in the league, but he's not necessarily like breaking the mold for a team, and he's not winning multiple playoff games long term into his career. So I think if we're looking at like the 75th percentile outcome for Michael Penix, it's probably Derek Carr.
I like that a lot. That's a really good comp.
Yeah, and so we go from the comps into the teams and the schemes themselves. Tej, I'm interested in some of the places that you think Penix may fit.
Yeah, so I was kind of going through the draft order and just listing some teams where I thought it would be really interesting to see him, and I really liked picturing him with the tight ends. I know that the tight ends want to start Will Levis next year, and I know that they have other needs like offensive line, but that's kind of where it led me to think of him in that spot where you have 2 receivers that can go out and win for you in Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins. You have a weaker offensive line that I think Penix can overcome by avoiding those negative plays like we've talked about. And I really would like to see what Brian Callahan can do with someone like that, and maybe even lean into a little bit of his mobility more. I was very impressed with what Callahan did with Jake Browning when he was starting at quarterback last year. And I think that there could be something similar with Penix this year. The Vikings have a pretty similar reasoning for me, where if they end up taking him at either number 23 overall or maybe in the second round, if they decide not to trade up for one of the top 4 quarterbacks, I think that you can have a situation where Penix is able to get the ball to Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, even Aaron Jones out of the backfield, like pretty quickly. Like I think they're set up pretty similar to Washington was in college for Penix, where that could be really interesting. And then the Steelers one is a little bit more of a stretch. Wanted to shout out our listener, Ron Yurko, who does a ton of good football analytics work. And he's been really pushing the Penix to Pittsburgh trend. So that's kind of got into my mind a little bit. But I think he would be really interesting there, as someone who could sit behind Russell Wilson and Justin Fields for a year. It'd be a lot of quarterbacks in one room. But I think he kind of fits that mold as well, where they have George Pickens. They're probably going to take a wide receiver at some point in this draft. We know the Steelers have been really good at developing receivers, and I think he can be someone that can, again, get the ball to them when needed and kind of fit the personality that the Steelers are looking for, where I think he can definitely be in that mold.
Yeah, for sure. And you look at some of those schemes, I really like how you highlighted the Titans' new scheme coming in and how it can kind of show what he does well. And I think obviously you have KOC at the Vikings, obviously a new regime coming in with Arthur Smith at the Steelers. Kind of the book is out, but he made Ryan Tannehill look really good at his time with the Titans, struggled a little bit more with the Falcons. Asa, I'm interested in understanding what scheme you think fits for Michael Penix.
Yeah, starting with Tej's comparison in the Vikings, I think he's a really good fit there, just considering the receiving talent the Vikings have. I'm a Vikings fan, and so a lot of people are very adamant about drafting a top 4 quarterback. But with KOC, if he's not willing to pay that price for, potentially future first-round picks it would take to get up there, taking Penix would be a pretty good consolation prize, in my opinion. So getting Justin Jefferson the ball, which is going to happen with Penix, I think is a very good outcome there. And then I think in regards to scheme, the perfect scheme is a scheme he's been in for the past 2 years, and that's with Ryan Grubb and the Seahawks. So it was Brett Coleman that brought up this pretty interesting idea for Penix going to the Seahawks. One of the first things is that he could serve as a translator for that offense for Geno Smith. Geno Smith is a pretty good quarterback, but he's not young by any means, being 33 now. And so having Penix drafted in the second round would be, in my opinion, a pretty good outcome where the Seahawks get Michael Penix, they translate the offense, and then as the years progress, he could end up kind of seamlessly transitioning to that starting quarterback role, especially with the receiving talent that the Seahawks have in DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and now Jackson Smith-Njigba. So Penix being able to consistently target those guys, I think would make for a pretty effective offense.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. Sorry, I just had a question for you quickly because you got my mind on thinking about this. You mentioned, maybe getting Penix as a consolation prize. I was curious, with how steep the rookie wage scale is, with the mainly the drop off from pick 1 to pick 5 being decently steep, and then pick 5 to pick 10 even further being really, really steep. Do you kind of see it as a surplus value type of valuation where maybe Penix isn't as good as May or McCarthy or any of the quarterbacks that the Vikings might trade up for, but he might not need to be just because of his rookie contract compared to some of the other guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can kind of look at a guy like Jalen Hurts, where, Jalen Hurts is quite possibly the best case scenario for a second round quarterback, but getting a guy like that, I don't think Jalen Hurts is a top 5 quarterback. However, whenever you have him at that cheap of a deal, you're able to surround him with talent. And the Vikings are kind of approaching that area. They're definitely not the most stacked roster in the NFL, but having Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, all of these guys kind of makes Penix the perfect guy to slide in. And I don't think he would start week 1, just given the fact that they've invested in Sam Darnold. But I do think in the future, he could start pretty soon if the Vikings end up picking him.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And you talk about Sam Darnold. We're in this spot where there's a lot of these quarterbacks that kind of have a similar profile to Penix, whether that's Sam Howell, who's with the Seahawks, as you noted, or Sam Darnold, all kind of in these spots where, does he start over them? Does he compete for a quarterback spot? Do they wait and let the veteran play? And that's kind of the situation that I noted was similar for him was the Broncos. Obviously, they're sitting in a range where he will probably be. Will it be a reach? Maybe. But, we've noted several times, if you're coming up to get a quarterback or if you're reaching, you might as well reach on a quarterback. And you look at that Broncos staff right now, and it's kind of the staff that really pushed the vertical passing game in the NFL, that Sean Payton staff, alongside kind of what Brady was doing in New England at the time in the late 2000s. And I think that Penix excels the most at pushing the ball down the field to good receivers in a good scheme. And that's kind of the Broncos' name of the game. At least that's what we've seen from Sean Payton. And so I've always wondered if it makes sense. Now, the one knock is obviously Sean Payton has operated with pretty accurate quarterbacks up until his last couple of years, where the Saints offense kind of sputtered with Jameis and obviously Taysom Hill playing pretty much a normal drop back passing role. And I think that's kind of where the break happens in the Broncos fit. But I think that all of yours are also great fits, and it'll be very interesting to see where he lands, particularly if he goes to day 2, because then it's kind of wide open. I mean, Will Levis ends up with the Titans, ends up starting a couple games. I think we could end up seeing a situation similar to that. But it's just interesting to note how it'll kind of play out with this player, given his range of outcomes, his floor, maybe a lower ceiling. It'll be very interesting to see where he goes. And so, Tej, 4 years from now, what do you think the most likely outcome in that manner would be?
This was probably the toughest one of all the ones we've done so far, just because like what you guys just talked about, like there's so many different situations where he could be used, whether it's a team needing a higher floor starter, maybe they want a backup, like you mentioned, Asa, with the Seahawks or another team like that. So I think it's very situation dependent. But Sam, like I think you brought up so many good points about kind of like where he'll fall in the hierarchy of quarterbacks, and like that's kind of where I'm thinking too. It's like fringe starter range where you can run an offense with him, but it limits the ceiling a little bit, or maybe really high end backup range. Like I think he'll kind of be floating in that tier while he's in the league. Like you think about the Jacoby Brissett, Gardner Minshew type career arc, and like I think he can fit in that pretty nicely.
Yeah, for sure. And Gardner Minshew was someone who kept coming up when in my brain, given the ability of him to go to situations, plug in and have quality reps, but also he's probably limiting the potential of your team, if not really limiting the output of your team at any given point in time. And so, Asa, I'm interested to see kind of what your thoughts on how he would fit into that distribution would be.
Yeah, I think with Penix, it's pretty situation dependent, as Tej mentioned. But I am a little bit higher on Penix than the consensus. I mean, it might be the bias of like just studying him for so long, working on this article. But I think that I could definitely see him being a Geno Smith type of quarterback in the near future. So not someone who is going to win a game because of that person, but someone who can kind of like ride the ship to the victory. So I think playing for the Seahawks, I think would be a good way of doing that, just considering the skills that he demonstrates that translate from college to pro. You know, a lot of people talk about the good and the bad of Penix, but the best part about him is that the good are the things you really want to be good. So things like pressure to sack ratio, we talked about, like average depth of target, that willingness to throw the ball deep is something that teams want to see. And so being able to demonstrate that ability is something that I think leads me to have a little bit more faith in him than most. But also if he's in a receiver room, or if he's in a quarterback room with these good receivers, then I think he's able to utilize that better than some of the other quarterbacks that would be coming up in this draft. So Vikings, Seahawks, if he's with a team like that, I think you could see him in that kind of 11 to 15 type of quarterback range.
I agree. And it's interesting because we've talked about multiple situation dependent quarterbacks. And typically I think that relies more on how mobile the quarterback is. Obviously, like with the Caleb Daniels, a generational skill set. You kind of think it doesn't matter as much what the environment is going to be. A Jaden Daniels, who is extremely mobile, particularly in scrambling, you know probably what it's going to look like at the NFL level. Drake May has, a prototypical size. Maybe he's able to overcome, and you kind of go on that curve where, Drake May, it probably is pretty important who it's going to be. But I think in terms of the surrounding cast, JJ McCarthy and Penix are very similar in terms of it really depends on who the supporting cast is, which is ironic because, you look at McCarthy, low usage rate, really good team. You look at Penix, high usage rate, really good team. They play in the CFP, and I really see them as having a similar range of outcomes. Now, I do note that I think JJ McCarthy's proven mobility kind of gives him the edge, and I think that's why he's in the conversation for, if not a top 4 pick, a top 15 pick, whereas Penix is really only in the conversation for, top 10 and back into day 2. But I think that's what kind of knocks Penix to the projection of, a swing starter or a quality backup in that Minshew mold. Another person that I noted who I think his career arc could really look like as well is Andy Dalton, where he has a couple good seasons with the Bengals. And every time you see Andy Dalton play, whether that's with the Panthers last year, with the Saints the year before, the Cowboys, you're always like, Andy Dalton's pretty good. So he's a good NFL quarterback, but he's not winning Super Bowls. He's not going to win you a ton of games. I could see a similar career arc where, year 2, year 3, we're like, this is a good player. This is a guy who's going to be in the NFL for a long time. And then maybe something goes awry. He loses a wide receiver. Situation doesn't ramp up exactly the same. And he's kind of no longer that. He's on another team or something like that.
Yeah, I love the comparison you made to Penix and McCarthy, because what's so interesting about them is how opposite they are. And this is something I talk about in the article, but McCarthy's young, Penix is old. McCarthy had a historically low usage rate for a top-end quarterback. Michael Penix had a historically high usage rate. And so whenever you look at the two, even though they have similar ranges of outcomes, like the way that they get there is so different, where McCarthy was good at these play action underneath routes and throwing over the middle, whereas Penix was great at trusting his receivers, throwing deep balls, things that kind of McCarthy struggled with a little bit. So I think what's so interesting is how they're so different, and yet the range of outcomes, in my opinion, could be similar, with McCarthy having a slight edge, but just given how different they are, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, you make a great point too, because in previous years, McCarthy would have been someone who everyone would have looked at and would have said, this is a guy who's played in a pro-style system, and thus that gives him the edge. Whereas Penix, you look at some of these old scouting reports, and like almost all of the weaknesses includes like didn't play in a pro-style system. But the NFL has evolved to the point where it's almost the opposite now, where people are dinging McCarthy for not have played in like a wide open system, but they're saying that he's mobile. And then Penix on the flip side played in a pro style, get it to your wide receivers system, but he's not mobile. And it's just interesting, the dichotomy of that and how the NFL has evolved.
I know that's actually a great point. Like, I don't think that playing in a pro style system holds up as much as it used to, and I don't even know if it ever should have really held up. Like, I think there's a separation between playing in a quote unquote pro style system and like having NFL throws. And I think like Asa, you brought up like Penix's big time throws that he had, like those are stuff that can translate to the NFL. Sam, you brought up Jaden Daniels' scrambling ability. Like, I think that's stuff that we can see translate to the NFL. Like, those are things that I feel more comfortable projecting to the next level versus like the type of scheme that you played in, just because of how much scheme changed in the past 5 years and how much it should change over the next 5 years.
And as you mentioned, Ryan Grubb has a job for a reason. Like, the previous offensive coordinator of the Huskies is now the offensive coordinator of the Seahawks. So, regardless of how someone feels about what's pro style and not, the NFL clearly has confidence in the style that Penix played being translatable to the NFL. So I think that'll kind of bump his stock a little bit as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point.
Yeah, for sure. And then you look even in that same vein, Cliff Kingsbury is the offensive coordinator and has been a head coach for many years. So it just kind of highlights, as we move into our final segment, the class play picks, which we've mentioned a lot of times in these class play picks. And initially this segment was just supposed to be something fun and something for people to follow along with, but it's almost ended up being, a history lesson for us and for the audience, hopefully, of like how times have changed. And I think being the last episode before the draft, we've kind of ended on this great summary where, times in terms of quarterbacks have changed so radically in the past 5 years. And maybe that's a facet of the coaching staff, like you said, Asa, like coaches coming up and rising the ranks and gaining more experience in college and moving to the pros. Maybe it's a result of players like Patrick Mahomes, as we talked about a lot last week with Caleb Williams. Maybe it's a result of Patrick Mahomes becoming the prototype rather than these more assassin, high intangible level quarterbacks like Manning, Brady, and Breeze. There's so many new variables to consider, and there's so many kind of new waves of offense moving in along with the rule changes that it changes a lot of how we evaluate quarterbacks. And kind of you look back at some of those old scouting reports and you're like, this isn't really telling me anything anymore. And like Tej said, like it's nice to know that, you know, people who are data centric, people who really follow the game have kind of made that change to where people kind of have a better idea of what to look at, of what changes college to pro.
Yeah, totally agree.
So as we move forward, we're ending up class play picks. Me and Tej picked our full team. We need to put a poll up to vote to see which team is better. Asa, you're getting a special, the Super Bowl of class play picks. And in that same vein that I just concluded on, a lot of cool stuff in this one. We're going to be picking our favorite single game college performance and one that we thought like made somebody's draft stock. And so Asa, you're the guest first. Tell us about one of your favorite performances from a college player.
Yeah, one of my favorite performances is Devontae Smith versus Ohio State in the national championship game. This is really the game where Devontae Smith had an incredible season prior to this, but whenever we see how great he did against this really high-level competition, it kind of showed that just because you don't have that traditional receiver body type of being like 6'3", 210, and this really high vertical, doesn't mean that you can't be effective. And we've kind of seen this with Devontae Smith both in college and the NFL. But having 215 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, just a completely unbelievable performance to have. Like those look like quarterback throwing numbers, and it all came from one receiver. One of my favorite moments from that was where Devontae Adams actually tweeted out, "From now on, if you misspell my name, make sure it's Devontae because he is that boy." And so I really think that kind of drove home just how talented he is as a player. And despite not matching that traditional receiver body type, he still demonstrated that, like, if you can beat press, you can be good in the NFL.
Yeah, and obviously he just cashed in with a pretty lucrative contract for himself, extending with the Eagles, and I think that's a great game to highlight. And in the essence of that history, just look at what's kind of come out of that game now. Steve Sarkisian goes on to Texas as a head coach after those incredible performances. Mac Jones gets drafted really high. A lot of, when you really think about it, a lot of touch points to Michael Penix Jr., given the Texas, the Mac Jones comparison and stuff like that. So really interesting to look at and good highlight, Asa. Tej, what about you, man?
So I also have one that happens to be a strong performance against Ohio State, which I apologize to, Professor Draper, Professor Ruddy, who hosted us at the Ohio State Sports Analytics Conference, also McKenna Hack, who used to work with us. Like, sorry that there's so much receiving performance against Ohio State here, but Rondell Moore against Ohio State, 2018. This was like, he had 12 receptions, 170 yards, 2 touchdowns, had the long of the 43-yard touchdown, made David Blau look really, really good in a game in that night game where Purdue ended up winning 49-20, just like a really special night in Purdue, and to pull off that upset against number 2 Ohio State was awesome to see. Also had some kick returns that he carried back as well. And like, I thought it was awesome to see that performance. I don't think his NFL career has been up and down, but it was just really cool to see like him completely take over a game, and for Purdue to end up blowing out Ohio State in that game was definitely one of the better memories of Purdue football, at least since I've started watching. And then another one on the defensive side of the ball was Ndamukong Suh against Texas in the 2009 Big 12 championship game, where he had 4.5 sacks, 7 tackles for loss, 12 total tackles against Colt McCoy and Texas. They ended up losing. Nebraska ended up losing 13-12 on a controversial call, whether there was 1 second left on the clock or not. But that was truly like one of the first times I can remember a defensive player completely taking over a game. He ended up having a couple of those in the NFL as well. So like that was awesome to see in such a high profile game like that also.
Yeah, and as we kind of round out draft season, as we've gone through some of these, players like Michael Crabtree and that had these big moments, it's been really interesting for me to just reflect on kind of how well I remember some of these things, despite not being super old. Like I was pretty young when that Ndamukong Suh game was, but I remember exactly where. Like I remember sitting in front of the TV watching the Texas versus Nebraska Big 12 championship game. Like I remember all these things so intimately, and it's just a show of kind of why we all work in sports. The community surrounding it, the memories, the fellas just talking around naming random wide receivers. And so I kind of went with two of those. Obviously, both of mine are going to be Louisiana based, but the first one, which I kind of note as the end of an era, is the Leonard Fournette game versus Ole Miss in 2016, where he ripped off like 2 or 3 50-yard runs, had a huge truck stick on the sideline. And it was just kind of the end of we talked about kind of the times changing and, people looking more at the throws that you can make or the ways that you can affect a game rather than the scheme you played in. That was really the last time we saw a top recruit play in an I formation, power run scheme of that manner. Even Michigan now doesn't run that much of a power offense. We see Leonard Fournette get picked really high. Obviously, now we look at that as probably, by process wise, obviously not a great pick, but he turns into playoff Lenny. He wins a Super Bowl with Tom Brady. He's very effective throughout his career. And it's just kind of like a passing of the torch. I don't know if we're ever going to see another running back, just by the way that we now look at running backs, in that Leonard Fournette mold anymore. And then kind of the flip side of that is the Cam Newton game versus LSU during his Heisman season, where he barely throws the ball at all, but he runs absolutely roughshod over LSU. And we come away with the idea that, these quarterbacks are different types of athletes. And he kind of sets that mold for what the modern quarterback now looks like, where, Jaden Daniels is going to get picked second. And a lot of that is because of his scrambling ability. And Drake May has that prototypical body, and it's not necessarily his prototypical arm that sets him apart from other people. It's his mobility. And I think that particular game, a top 10 matchup that was in that run of LSU defenses where they were just cranking people out the whole time all over the place to the NFL. And you look at them, and it's just kind of a turning of the tide moment that was really fun to watch in real time.
Watching Cam Newton in college was hilarious because he didn't look like any of the other players on the field, and especially like none of the other quarterbacks. So it's you're right. Like it was awesome to kind of see him, open up this lane for the league to get more used to his type of style and size at the quarterback position. I think we've really seen the progression, especially the past couple of years, like kind of building off of that Cam Newton mold that he put out there in that game that you mentioned.
For sure. And obviously he turns into an MVP and all that stuff. And you see him do a lot of the stuff that he did in that game at the professional level. So definitely kind of a game breaking moment, a video game type moment, and a movement towards, modern football. And so to finish up, Asa, thank you for joining us, man. Do you have anything to plug? Tell us about what's coming up on your podcast. Obviously, keep an eye on SumerSports.com for everyone in the audience for Asa's article. Asa, tell us about what you have coming up.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun recording this with you guys and kind of putting the work into this Michael Penix article. But for those of you who are interested in receivers, actually later today, I'll have a podcast coming out with Wes Chandler, former receiver from the Los Angeles Chargers, discussing upcoming receivers in the draft. So that'll be fun to talk to someone who knows a lot more about football than me in that regard. But yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys.
Yeah, no problem. And for those of you who haven't listened to Asa's podcast, he's assembled kind of an Avengers crew of guests. Lucky enough, me and Tej have been part of that Avengers crew.
We slipped in somehow. I think we're Ant-Man. We're probably Ant-Man in this analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so definitely go give Asa's podcast a listen. Keep an eye out on Sumer Sports. Tej, give the people a little highlight of what we'll be bringing them this week.
So probably some content from Buddy's Pizza. first off, but also me, you, and Ben Brown will be going live right after the draft from Detroit. We'll have a lot of reactions. We'll love to see what Ben's reaction is to who the Vikings take, your reaction to who the Saints take. I think that'll be a lot of fun. And then we'll turn around and come back, 18 hours ish later and with a Friday preview of what we think is going to happen on day 2. And if we still have the energy on Saturday, we'll also be doing a whole draft recap, some of our favorite drafts, our favorite picks. So be on the lookout for all of that from the Sumer Sports, both podcast feeds and YouTube channel.
Thanks for that, Tej. And again, Asa, we want to thank you a lot from Asa Arnold, Tej Seth, and Sam Bruchhaus. Thank you so much, and have a good one.